Sheriff Earl Dixon thought it was just another routine stop, a black man driving through his small southern town with a busted taillight. But when he slapped the cuffs on him, he had no idea he'd just arrested the new state governor. In seconds, Earl's world spirals into chaos. News cameras swarm, protests erupt, and his once loyal town turns on him. As his career and reputation crumble, every dark secret he's buried threatens to surface. Power, prejudice, and justice collide in a reckoning he never saw coming. Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Sheriff Earl Dixon adjusted his belt, feeling the reassuring weight of his badge and holstered pistol. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of Rockford, a town where he had long ruled with an iron grip, masked as law and order. He had spent years cultivating respect. Some called it fear, but to him they were one and the same. Cruising slowly down Main Street in his patrol car, Earl scanned the storefronts, nodding at familiar faces. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where outsiders were noticed, and where he made sure things stayed the way they had always been. He liked things simple. He liked being in control. Up ahead, a sleek black sedan glided past. A stop sign, not quite stopping, not quite running it either. It was a minor infraction, barely worth a glance, but something about the car made Earl's jaw tighten. Tinted windows, out-of-town plates, a vehicle that didn't belong. He flipped. On his lights, the car slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. Earl took his time stepping out, adjusting his hat as he strolled toward the driver's window. He liked these moments, the small pauses before a conversation started, where he already knew how it would end. He tapped the glass with 2 fingers. The window slid down smoothly, revealing a man in his late 40s, neatly dressed, calm eyes, meeting Earl's without hesitation. The kind of man who didn't immediately fumble for his license, who didn't avoid eye contact, who didn't look nervous enough. "Evening, officer," the man said, his voice steady. "Sheriff," Earl corrected. "License and registration." The man nodded, reaching into his glove compartment with deliberate, slow movements. Earl watched closely, his fingers resting near his holster. The man pulled out a leather wallet, handing over his ID along with the car's paperwork. Earl took it without looking, his eyes still fixed on the driver. "You in a hurry?" Earl asked, the drawl in his voice thick with unspoken authority. "Not at all." Earl glanced down at the license, reading the name. His breath hitched. Malcolm Hayes. It was a name he had seen in the news, a name that had been on every station. Just a few weeks ago, his grip on the ID tightened. He looked back up, really looking this time, as if seeing the man for the first time. The sharp suit, the composed demeanor, the faint, knowing smile. It was him, the new state governor. A slow, creeping heat crawled up the back of Earl's neck. "I'd like to know why I was pulled over, Sheriff," Hayes said, voice even, polite but firm. Earl opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The traffic stop had been routine, instinctual, but now it was something else, something bigger, and something told him that whatever happened next would change everything. Earl's grip tightened on the governor's license. His mind raced, but his face remained unreadable. This was impossible. Governor Malcolm Hayes had only taken office a few weeks ago, a man who had made headlines with promises of reform, especially in law enforcement. Now, here he was, sitting. In front of him, like any other driver Earl had stopped 100 times before. The moment stretched, thick and heavy. He had a choice. Let him go with a warning. Keep things simple, avoid attention. But something about Hayes's calm, expectant stare rubbed him the wrong way. The man didn't look rattled. He didn't look like someone who had just been pulled over in the middle of a town that wasn't his own. Earl decided he didn't like that. "You didn't come to a full stop back there," Earl finally said, keeping his voice steady. Hayes nodded slightly. "I see. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" There was a pause, a flicker of something unreadable in Hayes's expression. Then, with a quiet sigh, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. He stepped out slowly, standing tall, his posture unshaken. Earl glanced around. A couple of cars rolled by on the opposite side of the street, but no one seemed to be paying much attention yet. Good. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Earl asked, his eyes scanning over the governor's expensive suit. No bulges, no visible weapons, just my tapping his fingers against his belt. He could feel the power shifting between them, and he didn't like it. The way Hayes stood there, not arguing, not protesting, just watching. It made Earl feel like he wasn't the one in control. "Turn around, hands on the car," Earl ordered. For the first time, Hayes hesitated. A sharp breath left his nose like he was holding back something, but he said nothing. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hands on the roof of his car. Earl stepped forward, ignoring the small voice in the back of his head telling him to stop. He patted the man down, his movements firm, almost forceful. Of course, there was nothing. No weapon, no contraband, nothing at all. "You mind telling me why this level of force is necessary?" Hayes finally asked, his voice still calm, but edged with something heavier now. Earl ignored the question. He stepped back, glancing around again. He expected someone to have stopped, someone to have noticed, but there was nothing, just the low hum of passing cars, the rustling of leaves in the wind. He exhaled, tightening his jaw. Maybe it was time to end this before it got out of hand, but then he saw it, a teenager across the street. Phone raised, camera pointed straight at them, recording, and suddenly Earl realized he might have made a mistake. Earl's pulse quickened as he caught sight of the teenager filming from across the street. His grip flexed at his side, a sharp heat crawling up his spine. The situation had just changed. He turned back to Governor Hayes, who was still standing against the car, his hands resting lightly on the roof, calm, collected, like he had expected this from the moment Earl pulled him over. That only made Earl's frustration grow. "You got a problem, Sheriff?" Hayes asked, his voice even but edged with something sharper now. Earl clenched his jaw. He had two options, either end this now or double down. He knew which one he should take, but the presence of that camera made his decision for him. He wasn't about to let some kid's shaky phone footage dictate how this played out. "You got ID on you proving you're who you say you are?" Earl asked, ignoring the license still clenched in his own hand. Hayes exhaled through his nose. Something close, to amusement flashing in his eyes. "You're holding it, Sheriff." Earl glanced at the ID again, his grip tightening. Every instinct in him told him to back off, but something about Hayes' calm confidence grated against him like sandpaper. He hated that look. He had seen it before. A kind that said a man knew he was untouchable, that he didn't need to be afraid, that he was better. Earl had spent his life making sure men like that knew they weren't. "Turn around," Earl said, voice flat. "Hands behind your back." For the first time, a real flicker of disbelief crossed Hayes' face. He didn't move at first, like he was giving Earl a chance to reconsider. When it became clear that wasn't happening, he let out a slow breath and did as he was told. Earl pulled the cuffs from his belt and snapped them around Hayes' wrists. The sound of metal locking in place was sharp, final. "You're making a mistake," Hayes said, voice still controlled, but now carrying a weight that felt different. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was certainty. Earl ignored it. He guided Hayes toward his cruiser, his grip firm but not rough. He knew better than to make it look bad, especially with a camera on him. As he opened the back door and placed the governor inside, he cast another glance across the street. The kid was still filming. It didn't matter. He had arrested dozens of men before. He had taken control of 100 situations just like this. But as he slid into the driver's seat and reached for his radio, a cold realization settled over him. This wasn't like the others, because this time the whole world was about to watch. Earl drove back to the station, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. His jaw was clenched, his mind racing. The weight of what he had just done was pressing against his chest, but he shoved it down, refusing to let doubt creep in. He had done nothing wrong. Hayes had resisted, maybe not physically, but with that smug attitude, that quiet defiance. Earl had seen it before, men who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He wasn't about to let this one walk just because he had a fancy title. Still, his hands felt slick against the wheel. The governor sat in the back, silent, unreadable. He hadn't argued, he hadn't fought, he hadn't even asked for his phone. "Call," That silence was worse than anything he could have said. When Earl pulled into the station, he was met with a sight that made his stomach drop. Reporters, cameras, a storm waiting to break. How the hell had they gotten here? The deputies standing near the entrance, their expressions ranging from confusion to panic. Earl stepped out of the car, trying to keep his face neutral. He walked to the back, opened the door, and helped Hayes out. The cameras flashed, the noise rising as microphones were shoved toward them. "Governor Hayes, can you tell us what happened? Is this an unlawful arrest? Did the sheriff profile you?" Earl straightened his shoulders, keeping his grip firm. On Hayes's arm, the governor turned his head slightly, giving him a long, unreadable look before facing forward, ignoring the questions. They walked into the station, and the door swung shut behind them, muting the chaos outside. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Sheriff," Deputy Lawson stepped forward hesitantly. You might want to come see this." Earl barely acknowledged him. "Book him." The room went still. "Sir?" Lawson's voice dropped, his eyes flicking nervously to Hayes, then back to Earl. "You heard me?" Earl snapped. "Get him processed. Standard procedure." Hayes finally spoke. A voice calm but cutting. "I'd like to speak to my attorney." Earl scoffed. "You'll get your call like everyone else." But then the phone at the front desk rang. The receptionist hesitated before answering, her face going pale as she listened. When she looked up at Earl, her voice was almost shaky. "It's the governor's office. They want you on the line." Earl's stomach twisted, but he held firm. He wasn't about to back down now. He turned to Lawson. "Put him in holding. I'll handle this." As Hayes was led away, he cast one last glance over his shoulder at Earl, not angry, not pleading, just watching. And for the first time, Earl felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest, a sliver of doubt. Earl stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. The noise barely muffled the commotion outside. Phones ringing, deputies whispering, the low hum of the news broadcast playing from the TV in the break room. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The damn place was turning against him, and he wasn't about to let that happen. He snatched up the phone, pressing it to his ear. "Sheriff Dixon," a sharp voice cut through the line. "This is Thomas Grayson, Chief of Staff for Governor Hayes. You need to release him now." Earl clenched his jaw. "The governor was lawfully detained." Grayson interrupted, his voice cold as steel. "Sheriff, I don't know what kind of power trip you think you're on, but you just arrested the sitting governor of this state for a minor traffic violation. You are seconds away from a national scandal, and if you don't fix this immediately, you won't have a job by morning." Earl felt his grip tighten around the receiver. He wouldn't be bullied, not by some bureaucrat in a suit who had never stepped foot in a real town, who had never had to keep order among people who thought they could do whatever they damn well pleased. "The law applies to everyone," Earl said, keeping his voice level. "Title doesn't change that." "Then let me be clear," Grayson shot back. "If Governor Hayes is not out of that cell in the next 5 minutes, the Attorney General's office is filing charges against you personally. Unlawful arrest, civil rights violations, abuse of power. By tonight, your name will be plastered across every network in America, and your entire department will be under federal review." The line went dead. Earl slammed the phone down, breathing hard. His pulse pounded against his skull. He turned and yanked open the door, stepping back into the station. The room fell silent the moment they saw him. Lawson looked up from the front desk, face pale. "What's the holdup?" Earl barked. "Get the governor booked." No one moved. Lawson swallowed hard. "Sir, we've got a situation outside." Earl stormed toward the front entrance, throwing the door open, and his stomach dropped. The street was packed. Protesters, reporters, cameras flashing. People holding signs with words that made his blood boil. "Racist sheriff, justice for Hayes, abuse of power won't be ignored." The town he had controlled for years was turning on him. A voice blared from a news van. "Sheriff Dixon has yet to provide an official statement on the governor's arrest, but sources indicate that state officials are already intervening." Earl's breath was short, his fists clenched at his sides. The whole damn world was watching, and for the first time in his life, Earl Dixon felt something he had never felt before: fear. Earl stepped back into the station, slamming the door shut behind him. The roar of the crowd outside was muffled, but it was still there, pressing in on him like a vice. His hands were clammy, his breath short. He had spent years building his authority in this town, and now, in the span of an hour, it was all shifting uncomfortably. A few other deputies hovered nearby, avoiding Earl's gaze. They were waiting, expecting him to take control like he always did. But for the first time, Earl wasn't sure what move to make. The ringing phone snapped him out of his thoughts. The governor's office again, no doubt. He ignored it. Instead, he turned to Lawson. "Where is he?" Lawson hesitated. "Holding cell, sir. I really think—" "I didn't ask what you think," Earl snapped, cutting him off. "Take me to him." Lawson swallowed hard, then nodded, leading the way toward the back of the station. The hallway felt longer than usual, the air heavy with something Earl didn't want to name. When they reached the cell, Lawson stepped aside, letting Earl move to the bars. Governor Hayes sat on the bench inside, his posture relaxed, hands resting on his lap. He looked up as Earl approached, his expression unreadable. Earl grabbed the bars, leaning in slightly. "You think this changes anything?" he muttered. "You think a crowd of cameras is gonna scare me?" Hayes exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "I think you already know you made a mistake." Earl's grip tightened. "You ran that stop. Sign? You needed a reason," Hayes said, his voice even. "I get it. You've been running this town your way for a long time. But you overplayed your hand." Earl scoffed, but the sound felt hollow. "You're just another lawbreaker, same as anyone else I've put in here." Hayes leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "Then why are they outside? Why is your own department looking at you like they're waiting for you to self-destruct?" Earl opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You lost the moment you put those cuffs on me," Hayes continued. "The moment you let your pride, your need for control, override common sense. Now the question is, how much worse do you want this to get?" Earl stepped back from the bars, his pulse hammering in his ears. A door swung open at the front of the station, and a new voice called out, "Sheriff Dixon." He turned, heart dropping as he saw State Attorney Robert Langston step inside, flanked by 2 state police officers. The station fell silent. Langston's gaze was ice-cold. "Release. Governor Hayes, now." Earl felt the weight of a lifetime of control slipping from his grasp, and for the first time, he had no idea how to hold on. Earl's fingers twitched at his side as he faced State Attorney Robert Langston. The man was tall, crisp in his dark suit, his expression a mask of cold authority. The 2 state troopers behind him stood firm, their presence an unspoken threat. Earl had dealt with pressure before, but this was different. This wasn't some troublemaker trying to talk his way out of a ticket. This was the state itself coming for him. "I don't take orders in my own station," Earl said, keeping his voice steady. Langston didn't blink. "That's exactly what you're about to do." He took a slow step forward. "Governor Hayes is to be released immediately, and this entire situation will be reviewed at the state level. If you refuse, I will have you removed from duty on the spot." A muscle in Earl's jaw twitched. He had been sheriff for over a decade. This was his town. He didn't answer to some bureaucrat in a suit who had probably never worn a badge in his life. But as his eyes flicked around the room, he saw what he didn't want to see. His own deputies watching him, waiting, hesitant. They weren't standing behind him. They were waiting to see if he was about to go down in flames, and maybe he was. A long silence stretched between him and Langston. Then Earl exhaled sharply and turned to Lawson. "Get him out." Lawson hesitated, his eyes flicking between them. "Sir, now!" Earl snapped. Lawson hurried down the hall, and a minute later the sound of the cell door unlocking echoed through the station. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate. Then Governor Hayes stepped back into the main room, rolling his wrists as the cuffs were removed. He met Earl's gaze, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," Earl muttered. Hayes gave a small nod, like he had expected that answer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked past Langston toward the front entrance. The doors swung open, and the roar from outside flooded the station. The cameras, the reporters, the crowd, it was all still there, waiting. The moment Hayes stepped out, the noise erupted, flashing lights capturing the scene. The governor's legal team swarmed him, guiding him toward a podium that had been set up hastily on the sidewalk. Earl watched from inside, his hands clenched into fists. His world had just changed, but there wasn't time to process it. Langston turned back to him. "Expect a call soon, Sheriff. I'd advise you to start thinking about how you want to explain this." Then he was gone. The station was silent now, except for the distant noise outside. Earl looked at his deputies. None of them met his gaze. His chest burned with something. He wasn't sure if he was still the one in charge. Earl sat in his office, staring at the grain of his wooden desk, the voices from the television in the break room bleeding through the walls. He didn't need to watch the news to know what they were saying. He could already hear the headlines playing in his mind. Small-town sheriff unlawfully detains governor. Racial profiling. Abuse of power. Investigation underway. His fingers tapped against the desk, the only sign of the tension pulsing through his body. He had spent years in control, years making sure his authority was respected. Now, everything he had built was slipping away, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. A knock on his door made him look up. It was Lawson. Earl knew by the way he hesitated in the doorway that whatever he had to say wasn't good. "What?" Earl snapped. Lawson shifted on his feet. "Sir, the governor's holding a press conference outside." Earl exhaled through his nose, then pushed himself up from his chair. He knew he should stay put, let this blow over, but he couldn't help himself. His boots felt heavier than usual as he walked through the station and stepped toward the front. Doors. The moment he pushed them open, the noise hit him like a wave. Governor Hayes stood at a podium, cameras flashing, microphones aimed at him like weapons. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look shaken. If anything, he looked determined, as if this whole thing had unfolded exactly as he expected. "This isn't about me," Hayes was saying, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about a system that allows men in power to abuse their authority without consequences. It's about the people in this town, those who have been stopped for no reason, those who have been treated unfairly, those who have been ignored when they tried to speak up." Earl's jaw tightened. Hayes' eyes swept over the crowd, and for one brief second they landed on Earl. He didn't hold the stare for long, just a flicker of acknowledgement before he continued. "This is a turning point. I will not stand by and let this moment pass without action. There will be investigations, there will be accountability, and there will be change." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, reporters shouting over one another to get their questions in. Earl's hands curled into fists. Change. That word made his stomach churn. Change meant his way of running things was in danger. It meant that every decision he had ever made would now be scrutinized. It meant that his grip on this town, on his own life, was slipping. He turned on his heel and stalked back inside, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded as he stood there, staring at the floor. The governor had declared war, and Earl knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. Earl sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the dimly lit office. His inbox was flooded with emails, some from local officials, others from reporters demanding a statement, and a growing pile from state investigators requesting department records. Every single one of them was a threat, a crack forming in the foundation of his authority. He could feel it happening in real time. His power was slipping. A bottle of whiskey sat unopened at the edge of his desk. He had been staring at it for the past hour, debating whether taking a drink would help settle the fire burning in his chest or just make it worse. The station was quieter than usual. His deputies weren't talking to him like they used to. They weren't looking him in the eye. He could feel the distance growing, the way they hesitated when he gave orders. Even Lawson, the most loyal of the bunch, had been avoiding him. They smelled blood in the water. A sharp knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. He straightened in his chair. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Mayor Tillman stepped inside. The man was a relic, Just like Earl, old school, firm handshake, ran the town with the same traditional values Earl had spent his career enforcing. But now, as he stood in the doorway, there was something different in his face, something cautious. "Mind if I sit?" the mayor asked. Earl gestured toward the chair across from him. "Go ahead." Tillman lowered himself down with a sigh, rubbing a hand over his chin. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Earl already knew what was coming. "You know why I'm here," the mayor said. Earl leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You gonna tell me to step down?" Tillman exhaled through his nose, avoiding the direct question. "There's a lot of heat on us right now, Earl. The governor isn't letting this go, and the state's breathing down our necks. It's only a matter of time before they start digging deeper." Earl's fingers tapped against the armrest. "Let them dig." The mayor frowned. He knew what Tillman was implying. His past, the arrests, the quiet deals, the way he handled trouble in this town. It had never been a problem before. It had always been understood, unspoken. But now, with the world watching, it wasn't just whispers in dark rooms anymore. It was evidence waiting to be found. Tillman sighed again, heavier this time. "Step down, Earl. Save yourself before this gets worse." Earl's face darkened. "I'm not a damn coward." The mayor studied him for a long moment, then pushed himself to his feet. "Then I hope you're ready for what's coming." He left without another word, and as the door clicked shut behind him, Earl finally reached for the bottle. Earl woke to the sound of his phone vibrating against the wooden nightstand. His head pounded, his mouth dry, the aftertaste of whiskey thick on his tongue. He groaned, rubbing a hand over his face before grabbing the phone. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him to answer. "This is Dixon." He grunted. A clipped voice came through the line. "Sheriff, this is Deputy Attorney General Markson. I'm calling to inform you that as of this morning, your employment as Sheriff of Rockford County is officially terminated. Effective immediately." Earl sat up so fast the room spun. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The governor's office and the state attorney's office have conducted an initial review of your actions and passed complaints against you. Effective today, you are relieved of duty, and an interim sheriff will be appointed until further notice." Earl's grip tightened around the phone. "You can't fire me over one traffic stop." Markson's voice didn't waver. "It wasn't just one stop, Sheriff. You know that. A full investigation has been opened into your conduct, and I suggest you start preparing for what comes next." The line went dead. Earl's breath came fast and sharp. He sat there, phone still pressed to his ear, as the words settled over him like a death sentence. Fired. The thought felt foreign, impossible. He had been sheriff for over a decade. He was this town. They couldn't just strip that away from him, but as he swung his legs over the bed and planted his feet on the floor, a deep, gnawing feeling in his stomach told him that they already. And by the time he made it to the station, the place was crawling with state officials. His deputies, his men, stood stiffly near their desks, avoiding his gaze. Boxes sat stacked in his office, his nameplate already removed from the door. Lawson was the only one brave enough to step forward. "Sheriff," Earl cut him off with a glare. "Don't." Lawson hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him through. Earl stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against the desk, hands gripping the edge so tight his knuckles went white. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But it was. A knock at the door. He didn't answer, but it opened anyway. The interim sheriff stepped inside, a younger man, polished, professional, not from here, the kind of man the governor would put in charge. "Sheriff." "Dixon," the man said, his voice even. "It's time for you to leave." Earl turned slowly, meeting his gaze. There was no sympathy there, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that this was the end, and for the first time in his life, Earl. Dixon had no power left to fight it. Earl sat in front of the news camera, stiff in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. The bright studio lights bore down on him, hot and unforgiving. The air smelled of coffee and expensive cologne, a far cry from the dusty station he had once commanded. He had spent years keeping reporters at arm's length, dismissing them as vultures, always looking to twist the truth. But now they were the only ones willing to listen. Across from him, the interviewer, a young, sharp-looking woman in a tailored blazer, studied him like a specimen under a microscope. The network had jumped at the chance to have him on. Everyone wanted to hear from the disgraced sheriff, the man who had brought a firestorm down on himself. The cameras rolled. Former Sheriff Earl Dixon. The interviewer began, her voice smooth, but laced with something sharp. The world has watched your fall from power unfold in real time. Now that you've had time to reflect, do you believe you made a mistake? Earl squared his shoulders. I was doing my job. A job that cost you everything? He clenched his jaw. A job that kept order in a town that needed it. People act like I was some kind of tyrant, but I did what had to be done. Law is law. It doesn't matter if you're a governor or an average citizen. The interviewer didn't blink. Except the governor wasn't breaking the law, was he? Earl felt his pulse quicken. He ran a stop sign. She raised an eyebrow. A stop sign? Do you really believe that's why you He could feel the weight of the cameras on him, the millions of people watching from their homes, judging him, dissecting his every word. He had told himself he would use this interview to clear his name, to set the record straight. But now, sitting under the glare of the studio lights, he felt something he hadn't expected. Exposed. The interviewer leaned forward slightly. Your past has come under intense scrutiny, years of complaints, allegations of racial profiling, cases that are now being re-examined by the Attorney General's office. Do you regret any of it? Earl's throat tightened. I did what I had to do. The interviewer let the silence hang between them. Then finally she spoke. And where has that left you? The words hit harder than they should have. Earl exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break, but deep down, he already knew the answer. Alone. The segment wrapped up, the studio lights dimmed, and the crew moved on to their next piece. No one lingered to talk to him. No one shook his hand. As he stepped outside, the city buzzed around him, indifferent. For the first time in his life, he was just another nobody. Earl sat alone in a rundown motel room, the hum of the television filling the stale air. The walls were thin, the bed stiff, the light from the neon sign outside flickering against the window. It smelled of dust and old cigarettes, the kind of place no one stayed in unless they had nowhere else to go. He hadn't planned to end up here. He hadn't planned for any of this. On the screen, the news played another segment about the reforms Governor Hayes had pushed through since his arrest. The sheriff's department had been overhauled, new leadership put in place. Policies were changing, oversight committees were being formed. His name was still in the headlines, but not as a man of power. Now, he was the example, the warning, the cautionary tale. He took a sip of the cheap whiskey from the plastic cup on the nightstand, the burn doing little to dull the weight in his chest. His phone sat on the table, dark and silent. No calls, no messages. He had spent years commanding respect, demanding it. But it wasn't respect, was it? It had been control. And now that control was gone, stripped from him the moment he let his pride make a decision he couldn't take back. His wife had stopped answering his calls. His son hadn't spoken to him in days. His old friends in the department had distanced themselves, too afraid of being dragged down with him. The town he had ruled had moved on, and now so had the rest of the world. The news shifted to another story, some national crisis, another scandal, something bigger, something new. He watched as his name disappeared from the screen, replaced by the next man to fall. Just like that, it was over. He leaned back against the headboard, exhaling slowly. He thought about turning off the TV, but what was the point? There was nothing left but silence. The world hadn't ended with him. It never would. For the first time in his life, Earl Dixon was truly alone, and there was no one left to blame but himself.